If you've ever seen the movie The Big Short, then you probably know that there are a lot of things that are paralleling from 2008 compared to right now in 2025 with the economy and even the housing market and now the job market. And if you've never seen the movie, I highly recommend you go watch it. I think you can even watch it for free right here on YouTube. But assuming you've seen the movie, one of the characters in the movie, played by Steve Carell, is based on a guy in real life whose name is Steve Eisman, okay? And he is the Big Short investor who got extremely rich during the last economic downturn because he saw all the warning signs and he bet against the economy doing well. And now, fast forward to today, he is worth $1.5 billion. And he just came out recently and said Americans are past living paycheck to paycheck. That's ancient history. Now people are living from loan to loan. Imagine how bad things have gotten in the past few years. And I have been hammering this point for people to get out of debt and for people to get their financial house in order because things are getting very tough out there with the job market when it comes to being able to get a new job, when it comes to the layoffs. I just made the layoff survival guide so people can navigate their way through this tough economy. But really, even before any of that happened, you really had to be working on your financial house so that way things are in order. But many people haven't been doing that. And now, just like in 2007, Steve Eisman is warning about how fragile the American consumer is right now. He recently came out and said that consumers are completely broke. If you actually deduct the AI expenditures, the US economy is not even growing right now. And AI is not going to come and save everybody. In fact, it's going to hurt everybody when it comes to how many jobs it's going to take away from the economy. We just talked about how the other day, Amazon announced that they're looking at getting rid of 600,000 people in the next 7 years. But Steve says, look, without this AI boom, growth would be nearly flat at around 0.5% growth, or likely even lower, not the 3.8% that the BLS is reporting as of the second quarter of 2025. Essentially saying that all of the economic growth that we are seeing right now is completely fake. And part of the reason that people are broke right now is because of what happened during the pandemic. Obviously, there's been a massive amount of inflation that has been created. But besides that, when we had massive stimulus being poured into the economy, what it did is it kind of made a lot of people look creditworthy. It made a lot of people look better off financially than they really are because everybody got some sort of boost, whether it was a stimulus check or a PPP loan, something like that. A lot of people took advantage of all these things. And while all that was happening, the economy was actually in full collapse. But the stimulus just kind of covered it up. But now that all the stimulus has dried up and moved to the top of the ladder in the form of asset inflation, like the stock market and the housing market, things like that, people are back to being even more broke than before. That's why we're seeing student loan delinquencies at record highs. We're seeing credit card delinquencies on the rise. You're seeing car loan delinquencies on the rise. And so all these people got a check that made them look richer than they actually were. And then the banks bundled those inflated loans into asset-backed securities, which is the same playbook that happened back in 2008. I even recently covered how a lot of these subprime auto loans are baked into securities into the stock market right now, and investors aren't even blinking, even though delinquencies are at all-time highs. Sound familiar? Right now, Americans are $1.2 trillion in credit card debt and $676 billion in debt with their car loans. And when you add in mortgages and student loans, it starts to look even worse than that. Americans owe $20.83 trillion on their mortgages right now. And they also owe $1.81 trillion on student loans. So it's no wonder with this record amount of debt and income not even keeping up anywhere close to where it needs to be to pay all this stuff off, that people are going broke. The 90-day credit card delinquencies have more than doubled since 2021, and auto loan defaults have also soared to a record high just this past month. And the banks who are desperate to avoid repossession, they actually don't want to repo your car because it costs them money and they're going to end up losing money anyways. What they do is they modify the loan, call them current, and then they just kick the can down the road and kind of pretend it's not a problem, just like the federal government's been doing with all the delinquent FHA loans. And they're not foreclosing on people. They might start doing it now. But prior to September of 2025, they were just paying the bills for people. They were just giving people loan modifications. They were just turning 30-year mortgages into 40-year mortgages, just kicking the can down the road. So we are now at a point in our society where about 69% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and about 25% of folks are using buy now, pay later just to pay for groceries. People are literally financing food and they spend the next 2 or 3 months paying for those groceries. And these interest rates can hit 36% after just one single missed payment. Everybody thinks that buy now, pay later is risk-free, and it is if you make all the payments on time, but you miss one and they got you, man. And that's why the entire economy is fake right now, because it's all based on debt, and it has been for a long time. But the situation has been amplified times 100 over the past 5 or 6 years, because pretty much all of the demand that's happening throughout the economy right now when it comes to purchasing, when it comes to GDP, is all being fueled by, number one, debt. People buying things that they can't afford, but it keeps the economy moving. We have easy access to credit here. It's too easy. That's why you see record amounts of delinquencies. Clearly, people aren't qualified to take on this debt. And then you have the ones who are not going into debt, the very wealthy people who can afford to pay for everything still, where the top 10% are accounting for 50% of the spending in our economy. So really, it's all just one big illusion, and it's going to be just a matter of time before this whole thing comes crashing down. And because America's consumers are completely tapped out, the only question left is how much longer can the charade go on? How much longer can the government pretend everything is fine? How much longer can the Fed pretend everything is fine and continue with interest rate cuts even though inflation is going up and no one can already afford things as it is? And that kind of brings me right to my next point. If the economy is so good, then why do so many people still feel like everything is falling apart? Well, they feel like everything's falling apart because it is falling apart. That's the real answer. But let's dive into some of the details of this. The first thing is we just have growing economic anxiety despite all the good indicators. Many Americans feel uneasy even though the GDP growth is looking good. And we just covered that because Steve Eisman says it's all fake because it's all based on the AI economy, which 99% of people are not benefiting from right now. And then, of course, everybody's being told one thing. Everybody's being told that unemployment is still historically low and the job market's still relatively strong. Yet, it seems like nobody actually has a good enough job to pay the bills. And a lot more people are not working or have a good enough job to pay the bills than what we're being told. That's called functional unemployment. Plus, the wealthiest 10% of our society is masking how bad the 90%, the bottom 90%, is actually doing right now because they have so much and they can spend so much that it really props things up. The perfect example of this right now can be seen in the U.S. housing market, where median home prices across the United States continue to climb, even though most people cannot afford a home. Well, why is that happening? Because more than 50% of the sales that are taking place are at the highest end of the market, homes that are $500,000 or $700,000 or more. And then you have the layoff fears and job market fragility. Workers that even have a stable job right now and solid incomes are worried about being laid off as companies are freezing hiring altogether and cutting back to only essential employees. And AI and automation is making it easier than ever to do this. And even people who are doing good and are seeing their portfolios rise are a little bit nervous because people recognize that this is not really normal. How much longer can this go on for? When is it going to come to an end? And what's going to happen to my wealth and my portfolio when it inevitably does come to an end? And a lot of job recruiters are also reporting that even experienced workers can't find jobs despite a supposedly strong labor market, which we know the labor market's not strong. That's supposedly the main reason why the Federal Reserve is cutting interest rates right now, even though inflation's still a big problem. And then the signs of a cooling economy are basically everywhere. A recent Moody's survey shows that 64% of Americans expect a recession within the next year, and 22 states are actually already statistically in a recession. That's half the country, guys. And Moody's was the same company that came out recently with a report saying that if California or New York goes into negative territory and they go into a recession, it's going to drag the rest of the country down with them, because those two states are responsible for the highest share of GDP in our nation. And then we have inflation fatigue and declining consumer confidence. Households who are earning six figures and on paper are doing well are saying it's becoming harder and harder to maintain their lifestyle and their standard of living. People are tired of spending just to cover the basics. Many people plan to spend 10% less during this 2025 holiday season, which is actually the lowest optimism going all the way back to 1997, even before the GFC. Also, you have bargain hunting and value shopping on the rise, which signals that people are being more cautious than ever right now with their money, which is a smart thing. I'm glad to at least report that that's happening, because the last thing you want to see is people just kind of throwing in the towel and saying, well, whatever, I'm already not doing good. I might as well just charge the most amount of money up on the credit card and go up to my eyeballs in debt and then just file for bankruptcy. Some people use that as the easy way out, but it's not really the easy way out, because even though they might get away with not paying a lot of that debt back, their financial future is essentially destroyed. And then we have widening inequality in our society. The middle class and lower income families are falling behind despite the good economic data that we keep being forced down our throats. Wages for people who are earning under $60,000 per year are growing slower than people who earn a lot more. And many households now have less in savings than they did prior to the pandemic. And about 25% of households have no emergency savings at all. Zero. Nothing. And then there's the emotional impact on everybody from all of this. A lot of people are describing themselves as confused and just waiting to see what happens next. The uncertainty has also caused a trend in the workplace, which is called job hugging, where workers tend to cling to their current jobs out of fear that they won't find another. And really, that's kind of the smart thing to do right now. Even financially stable families are admitting right now that something feels off and they feel like something bad might be around the corner. Now, I know as bad as all of this sounds, the one light at the end of the tunnel is that every economic downturn that we've ever experienced, we've always bounced back from eventually. The Great Depression was definitely the worst. You had the stock market crash in 1929, where it took 25 years for the stock market to get back to where it was prior to the crash. And that was probably the biggest example of this ever happening. Okay, and we might be in for something like that again right now, because there are so many parallels to what's happening today, just like there was in 1929. So there is a possibility that this can last for a very long time. But the point is, eventually we will get out of it, just like we did back then. And the good thing is, it's probably going to take a lot of fiscal responsibility in this country for us to actually get out of it. That's why you're seeing price of gold explode right now. And I think the US, if they want to have any shot at retaining their global reserve currency status, might be forced back on the gold standard. And if they refuse to go back on the gold standard, well, then the world's going to force them to go back on the gold standard by removing the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. And the smart countries are going to go back on the gold standard on their own. So whether the United States government decides to go back to a gold standard or not, it doesn't matter. It's going to be forced down their throats by the rest of the world. And I almost forgot to mention, I'm walking down Meadow Ridge Drive today in Corte Madera. Another thing that we're just now starting to see are cracks showing up in the credit system and how this is going to affect the economy moving forward. Recently, the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey cautioned that the recent collapses of the subprime auto lenders Tricolor and First brands could point to deeper weakness in the financial system. This is something I've covered here on the channel already. Those are early warning signs that people pay attention to. People like Steve Eisman, and that's how he made $800 billion during the last huge crash. People who ignore this are the ones who lose out tremendously. And the reality is the lending industry is just becoming too lax right now. There's been too much complacency in lending and too much risk taking, just like we saw back in the situation leading up to 2008. Because for the past decade, the markets have been acting like lending has been risk-free, and investors and lenders are both becoming more comfortable with the idea that the more you lend, the better, even though people cannot afford to pay it back. So how does that work? But as the borrowing costs rise and the defaults continue to tick up, a lot of analysts are warning that the hangover from the years of easy money could be worse than a lot of people expect. I think it's going to be worse than most people are expecting. I think we're going to see a very similar situation play out like we saw during the GFC, maybe even like the Great Depression. And this tricolor bankruptcy is a perfect example of what we're talking about here, because these credit markets show that private lending could be hiding a lot of bigger systemic risk than a lot of people realize. Too much money has been chasing too few assets over the past few years, which has been creating distortions in asset values and blown up these asset bubbles to record highs, and it's about ready to all unravel. And even with bankruptcies at near record highs right now, the credit spreads remain at near record lows, which kind of further backs up the complacency that we're seeing in the lending industry right now. These lenders are not asking for large returns on these risky loans. I think a lot of people are underestimating the crisis that's happening behind the curtains right now, because on the surface, all the economic data is still showing strength, but that's all by design. No administration essentially ever wants to show any weakness in their economy, and this one is no different. And something I touched on just a little while ago, but I want to finish this video talking about this, is how Americans have been changing their salary expectations in order to adjust to the weak labor market that we're in right now. About 2/3, 65% of Americans surveyed said they're willing to take a job for which they are overqualified for, and 26% had already done so, while 75% said that they would take a pay cut to keep their current job, with 16% having already accepted one of those. That just goes to show you how bad the job market is right now. People are scared to death of losing their job and are willing to take a pay cut or willing to be underemployed, essentially, at a future job just to be able to have an income. And I don't blame them. That's what people should be doing, because people need to hang on for dear life to the income. If you don't have income, you have nothing. More and more people are coming of the mindset that a job is better than no job. I've always thought that myself, and could never understand why somebody who was making good money wouldn't, kind of swallow their pride a little bit and go down to taking a job that's, far beneath their skill and pay grade just to be able to keep an income coming in. And one of the reasons it's so hard to get a job right now is because entry-level and mid-level roles are extremely crowded right now with highly experienced applicants, and 59% of professionals have recently been told in the past year that they are overqualified for the job that they're applying for. And the crazy thing, sometimes employers won't even hire you if you're overqualified for the job. A lot of people that can easily handle the job don't end up getting it just because they're overqualified. Also, people who end up actually getting a job that they are overqualified for can run the risk of kind of being trapped in a position like that, and when they go to look for a job that they actually are qualified for, might get pigeonholed into that lower level role. Kind of similar to how you have actors and actresses that get typecast for a certain role. Once you play the bad guy in a movie, then you're expected to always play that same type of bad guy in a lot of movie roles moving forward. Otherwise, you just might not get the part. The same is actually true for the job market. But I think the people who are actually hanging on for dear life for their current job, or even willing to accept a small pay cut just to keep their job, are doing the right thing, because people don't really have a lot of other great options, and that is far better than the alternative, which is losing your job altogether, waiting for unemployment to come through, only getting paid a fraction of what you were before, and then once that dries up, good luck finding a new job in this economy. Just ask anybody else looking for one right now. But if you've been preparing, like we've been talking about on this channel for the last several years now, then if you do lose a job, you should be fine. And I highly recommend anybody who's worried about this, go watch my recent video, the Layoff Survival Guide. I pretty much cover almost everything you need to know if you're worried about this happening to you. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. And if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here, and I'll see you in the next one.